right, here we go. Good morning, everybody. Well, at least I guess it's morning still for all of us. I know it's 6 a.m. here on Maui. Today is Friday, January 31st, and we are on day 2 of our Wild Horse Summit for 2025, putting the A in advocacy, arming yourself with knowledge to effectively advocate in 2025. And today I am very excited to welcome Jen Britton and Christian Hunold. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Christian?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, perfect. Um, I've known these two for a couple of years now, and they're both just really great people. We've had them present in the past at our conferences in Washington, D.C., and what they've talked about has just been extremely popular. So get your pen and your papers ready, put your notes on them and your questions in the chat box because we're about to hear something really, really great from these two. I want to introduce Jen Britton. She's a wild horse photographer and advocate who visits and documents wild and free roaming horses and burros across the U.S. Jen's scholarly research is situated in the fields of science, technology, and society, and human animal studies. Her research interests included 20th century American urban and suburban development, and with Christian, the politics of wild horses and burros. Jen is Drexel University's Executive Director for Sustainable Development Strategy, and her teaching interests focus on multi-species art and ethnography, climate change, and the social studies of space. Christian, PhD, is a professor of political science at Drexel University in Philadelphia. With a background in social movement studies and democratic theory, he asks how we can do better, include non-human animals in political decision-making. Christian's collaboration with Jen has produced a series of what I would say are fantastic papers on the contentious politics of wild horses and burros in the American West. Christian is a passionate wildlife photographer and avid cyclist. All right, Christian and Jen, I'll let you screen share and you guys are set to go.
Cool, thank you,
Thanks for having
Heather.
us, Heather.
All right, hopefully that worked on my screen share. Does everybody see a slide that says making the case for protecting wild horses and burros?
Yes, ma'am.
Right on. Okay. So thank you so much, Heather and Chris, for putting this gathering together. We agree that it's so important for advocates to get together, especially around creating shared language and shared arguments. And so what we wanted to do today was share a little bit about how we approach our academic research around wild horses and burros in the hopes that it can provide you with some framing or some language that can support the way you are advocating, whether that's in how you are approaching your elected representatives, how you are thinking about the way you're showing up at roundups to witness those, and so on. So my next slide, okay, my next slide, I think I can kind of fly past because we already covered who we are. But if it wasn't obvious, we are married and we live in Philadelphia. And we both are part of Drexel University here in Philly. So just kind of a quick summary of the projects that we already have in the can and what we're working on now. We actually got started doing this work kind of by accident. We had a funny day when I came home from Assateague Island with a bunch of photos of the state line mares brazenly breaching the state line fence, which is supposed to keep the Maryland ponies out of Virginia. And here were the Maryland ponies returning to Maryland from the Virginia side. They clearly do this all the time, and showed these pictures to Christian, who said, "Oh, I am right now, as we speak, putting together a research symposium with some colleagues from around the world in human animal studies about animals and borders." And so that launched our first paper about Assateague Island, where one of our conclusions was about the concept of wildness, that it's not that there's no one kind of official definition of wildness. It's something that is defined and negotiated by everybody involved in experiencing it. From there, we shifted to a project about mobilities and really essentially immobilities. And we talked about climate change where HMAs are concerned. and pointed to kind of a problem of imagination that is kind of shared certainly by BLM and to some extent, honestly, by advocates, in which horses are sort of stuck in these places that they can't migrate from, they can't move from, and these places in HMAs with climate change are going to be kind of steadily more inhabitable, and that requires some problem solving. We did a really fun paper about the Burros of Riverside County, and we talked about in that paper a kind of conviviality, a local culture where humans and burros are coexisting together in a really kind of productive way. And we described that, and we also described some of the ways in that area where different kinds of spatial logics change that dynamic to be one that is more adversarial. Most recently, I guess it was last year, we published a paper specifically about roundups and gender. And we identified some of the dynamics of these kind of mutually incompatible, what we call affective approaches, affective meaning sort of having to do with expression and emotion, and how that is related to power relationships at roundups. So roundups as a place where different players come together and act out these very, very gendered roles. Right now, we're working on a project that dives a little bit more deeply into the ways that, well, we're both photographers. We come to this work through wild horse photography. And so we're looking at the ways that advocates and photographers are using that art to do this very rich kind of storytelling that supports multi-species justice. And multi-species justice for us is a goal, sort of supporting that as a goal of our research. Whew. Okay, so moving along. So we're social scientists, and we are coming at this work from a much different perspective than sort of the researchers who have been creating the body of work about wild horses. Move some things around on my screen. So the dynamic in terms of animals needing protection and research is that a lot of animals pull political support from for conservation from science. But where wild horses is concerned, the research that exists sort of is coming from opposition to horses, right? Most of the academic research that you see out there is about the problem of wild horses, how to get rid of wild horses. If only we could kill all the wild horses, right? And that sort of characterizes the rangeland management literature. And our goal with our work is to broaden that literature and essentially to add a body of knowledge that comes from Team Horse, right? That comes from a position of caring for horses and believing that they are political actors in their own right. So sort of an example of some of so there is a little bit of work out there, and we've drawn from it to create our own work. J. Sanford Raccoon at the University of Missouri, and I know I've pointed some of you to his work, did some really great ethnography around the wild horses of Missouri and the movement to protect them in the 90s when the National Park Service decided to remove all of those horses from the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. Claudia Notsky, a Canadian researcher, has done some really kind of interesting stuff on wild horse tourism as well. Janaki Bhattacharya has done some stuff around Indigenous communities in Western Canada. And like, that's kind of it for...
Yeah, there's not a whole lot more, really.
For what's on the scene in terms of the scholarly work on wild horses from a point of support for wild horses. So that's where we come in. So in the ensuing slide, we're going to walk you through kind of the framing of knowledge that informs wild horse management now the problems with it, and then we're going to shift to kind of our answer to those issues.
Mhm.
All right, so I'm going to talk kind of briefly about kind of coming back to rangeland management science. This work comes mostly from land-grant universities, mostly in the West. And these land-grant universities, they were founded to support American agriculture and promote the interests of ag stakeholders. And the research that comes out of their agriculture schools reflects that. So they're doing research that is about kind of managing rangeland for grazing, for forestry, et cetera. And the funding comes from federal agencies, U.S. federal agencies, Department of Interior, to some extent, National Science Foundation. And it reflects federal priorities in those agencies, and that is managing public lands for grazing, and other kinds of resource extraction. And the concern around ecological issues is limited, and Christian will talk about that in a second. But really the priority is how do we make the most of the resources on these public lands where grazing is concerned. In all cases that I've seen so far, the rangeland management science research starts with the premise that wild horses are a problem, that there are too many of them, and further, that wild horse advocates are a problem, and that there are too many of them. And this is a discovery that when I first bumped into it, made me scream. It's what essentially inspired our paper about roundups. But it is the case that, BLM as a public agency, they're required by law to draw on science for their decision making. And this is the science that they draw on. So we are working on kind of challenging this science. So I'm going to hand it to Christian, who is going to talk about the environmental policy setting that we're doing this work in.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think you sort of teed that up very nicely. So in sort of the big picture history of American environmental policy, right? So this starts in a way in the late 19th, early 20th century. The frontier has closed, and the sense that natural resources like timber, coal, maybe not coal at the time, but timber certainly, that is unlimited, is sort of being challenged, right? It's not, in fact, unlimited. And so there's a concern in the early 20th century, sort of starting with the Roosevelt administration, to think about a more rational way of managing natural resources, right? Sort of this is the origin of our natural resource agencies like the Forest Service.
I'm sorry, I really just messed up screen sharing. I'm very sorry.
Really?
I think so.
Can we get a feedback on what you guys
No,
can see?
I got it back. Sorry. That's me blundering around.
Yeah, why are you? Okay.
Keep going.
All right. Can you all hear us? I'm not.
Yeah, you guys are good. We can see and hear.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Okay, so calm down, stop. Okay. All right. So natural resource agencies, and all of that isn't really about protecting, there's very little, if any, ecological knowledge of the time. It's not really about protecting sort of what we today would consider the environment. It's really all about more rationally managing and sustaining natural resources so that we can sort of keep exploiting them in the future. And so this sort of natural resources way of thinking gets baked into federal and state agencies over the next sort of half century. And it's not really until, right, the sort of Rachel Carson in the 1950s and 60s beginning to challenge sort of our sort of unfettered industrial development, and you get the emergence of the modern environmental movement, which has sort of different priorities. And instead of just managing natural resources, we're now starting to think about ways of protecting ecological relationships and what that means and how that can be done. And these kinds of concerns get sort of tacked onto these already existing agencies like Department of Interior, National Forest Service, land management, right? All of which are primarily occupied with better ways to extract resources from the land, and not so much, if at all, with protecting ecological systems and relationships, right? So that's sort of a later arrival. which leads to this sort of situation where a lot of our public land is managed by agencies whose history and mission continues to revolve around basically diverse forms of industrial development, right? The main job of the National Forest Service is to build roads, right? To make logging accessible to logging companies. It's not, as you might think, to protect the forest, right? Beyond its sort of capacity to deliver timber. So that creates a situation where land management is still rooted in and committed to these older priorities of sort of extraction forever in this sort of capitalist framework. Environmental protection issues are sort of tacked on later. And then it's a constant battle, right, between sort of the old school, what are sometimes called the lords of yesterday, timber, mining, et cetera, drilling, logging, to keep doing what they're doing, and attempts by environmental scientists, ecologists, new sort of generations of agency officials to push back and say, wait, what about the ecology? And I think I want to sort of make 2 points here for the purposes of this transformation, of this presentation. One is that these policy priorities are incredibly stable, right? These commitments are almost entirely unaffected by partisan issues. Like, it doesn't matter whether you have a Republican or a Democratic presidential administration. These policy systems around land management exist sort of almost completely independently. That doesn't mean that the Secretary of the Interior or the head of BLM can't set priorities and reorient those priorities to some extent. But they can't fundamentally, correct course or make the ship stop or make it go somewhere completely different. That is very rare, almost never happens. So stability, continuity, this kind of path dependency is built into these agencies and incredibly difficult to shift. I mean, there are kinds of rhetorical differences between different administrations, of course, and different ways of talking about land management, but ultimately what happens on the ground is often, indistinguishable from sort of administration to administration. There's some dissenting voices, of course. Peer, I think there's a peer presentation I saw somewhere in part of the summit. But again, it's not that there are voices in the wilderness. I just want to make it clear that what they're up against is incredibly difficult to change.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So another way to think about how wild horse management work comes from the work of a French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault, who many of you will never heard of. What's interesting about this is the notion of biopolitics, sort of a way to think about the administration of life, mostly sort of human life, around public health, around economic growth. It's a way to think about our essentially very highly quantified way of administering human life in society, counting births, deaths, health statistics, in incredibly sophisticated ways, and increasingly sort of creating bureaucracies for the management of humans. That's all about numbers and all about technical expertise, right? Doctors, physicians, public health people, kind of administering human life. And it's a way that we've applied to sort of the management of non-human life is incredibly helpful because it sort of helps us understand how what shows up as ostensibly scientific and technical decisions about wildlife management, right? Which species get to live, which species get to die, and in what numbers, that all of those decisions are in fact deeply political and informed by normative, non-scientific values. So in wildlife management, including in the management of wild horses, a lot of what you see coming out of agencies like BLM and the rangeland management system is sort of a discourse that's all about the regulation of risks that are associated with living organisms, right? Sort of disease transmission, damage to infrastructure, damage to grasslands in this case, right, by horses, and how those risks are sort of identified, measured, classified, sorted into categories, and then sort of dealt with. And it all sort of reads as a very sort of technical, objective, dispassionate exercise when it is often anything but. And so what this framework in our work helps us do is sort of uncover processes by which organisms are sort of identified and sorted into different categories, right? Valuable, not valuable, worthy of protection, not worthy of protection, killable or not.
Native and not.
Yeah, the nativeness, are they invasive? Are they overabundant? What does that even mean? And of course, this is also how this is precisely the same kinds of categorizing that we do with human others, right? Whether they're migrants or women or men or people with disabilities, etc. So the upshot of all of this is that even though horses are nominally protected from being killed, at least when they're on designated public lands like this, they are in fact still subject to removal and detention on all of these grounds, as of course all of you know. Next slide. And so another sort of source of scholarship that we're engaged in here is to sort of so what we're doing is we're sort of pushing back against that, right? We're pushing back against the rangeland science, against this kind of biopolitics, and human animal studies, which is sort of a really interesting field that combines and brings together insights from the social sciences and to some extent from ethology, right? Animal studies, the study of animal behavior, wildlife biology, if you want. It merges them into a new kind of discipline that focuses on the relationships between non-human and human beings. So we're not, right? We're not wildlife biologists who are sort of studying equine behavior, right? We think we need to know that stuff. We draw on that. We think it's interesting, of course. But what concerns us in our work is to sort of understand the politics of human, non-human interactions and relationships, right? What happens in the between in these spaces. And that can be anywhere, right? Where humans and animals come together. It can be companion animals. It can be farmed animals. It can be the sort of how humans and their research animals interact in the biology department at Drexel University, for example, right? So all kinds of spaces where human and non-human animals come together. What this field does, it rejects human exceptionalism, right? It doesn't say humans are better, smarter, more rational, fundamentally different from all other non-human animals, right? It sort of sees that as a more continuity, there's more continuity there, evolutionary continuity. It also treats non-human animals not as objects or as indistinguishable individuals, but as subjects, right? With lives, with meaning making in their lives, right? It matters to a non-human animal, minimally, to be alive and not be killed. As complex individuals with societies and cultures of their own. The field prioritizes sort of non-exploitative ways of thinking about non-human animals and our relationships with them. So there's some overlap here with the animal rights movement, with animal liberation, although there are also some distinctive differences, I think, between these approaches. And the upshot for us in our work and other people who do this kind of work is to articulate sort of richer conceptions of multi-species flourishing, multi-species justice. So for instance, what might a vision of Western rangelands that is inclusive of wild horses and all kinds of people and all kinds of other animals and plants, what might that look like, right? And when you take that perspective and you don't primarily or at all think of wild horses as a problem to be solved, right, you're pointed in very different directions in terms of the kinds of things that you care about and how you think about them and how you research them. And I think with that, oh no, I have one more slide. So compassionate conservation is sort of another strand of academic scholarship that we occasionally draw on that has inspired us. So in conservation science, right, when you sort of, and practice, when you sort of think of species protection or setting up protected areas in order to protect certain species, or when you're sort of concerned about a sort of quote unquote invasive species displacing a native species, a lot of this discourse is about populations, right? Animals are sort of conceptualized by conservation scientists as populations, as species, as sort of aggregates, right? Individual animals don't matter in a way, right? In this way of thinking, they're thought to be sort of functionally interchangeable. You know, you need some males, you need some females, you need sort of some kind of age distribution, but the individuals themselves don't really figure in this way of thinking about sort of managing populations. And what compassionate conservationists sort of say, this comes out of the conservation field itself, right? Where people are terribly disillusioned with the work of, killing hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of sort of species that are not valued, right? I mean, those poor guys that have to go out now and shoot barred owls out of the trees in the Pacific Northwest, right? In a desperate effort to save the northern spotted owl, for example, that kind of work. And so advocates of compassionate conservation who are sort of trying to reform conservation science from within a little bit. So say, well, how would this change if we took the lives of individual animals more seriously, if we treated organisms as sentient and deserving of our sort of moral concern? And what happens if we sort of push back against this view of conservation as just concerned with populations? Could we do this in a way that doesn't require as much killing, as much violence, as much discounting and devaluing of life, right? The approach is basically to say, all life matters, all life counts. If we believe that, is there a way to create more flourishing ecological futures for everyone that rely less on taking out shotguns and killing the species that you don't like, right? That's the sort of aspiration from compassionate conservation.
Cool.
Jen.
All right. We have just one more slide with some content. I'm going to kind of wrap up by talking about how we work in the realm of feminist science studies in STS. STS stands for Science, Technology, and Society. It's my field. And in STS, we ask sort of critical questions about the development of science and technology, like who gets to do it? What are ways in which science and technology have cultural assumptions about race and gender, for example, baked into them? In both of these sort of fields, we start to consider how especially where wild horses are concerned, how ideas and assumptions about gender especially interact with kind of technological and science, development of science. Coming back to the rangeland science, that is a really male-dominated field. BLM management, in the field is very male-dominated, and it's inescapable to notice that way more advocates than not are women. The BLM is getting its knowledge from this science, and this science contains contempt for women and wild horse advocates. They cannot hide it. I mean, they try to hide it in sort of weasel language, but it's pretty obvious. Ecofeminism critiques the idea of the kind of liberal autonomous subject. What do I mean by that? Like put aside that American liberal conservative spectrum idea. So we're talking about the sort of classical liberalism, which as political concept, prioritizing the individual as the most important kind of political unit. It has been historically liberating in some pretty important ways, where belief systems, sort of more older belief systems, may keep people subjugated, right? So our concepts of citizenship today kind of are based on this notion of individualism, ideas about individual freedom, the individual as kind of the be all end all. But what we forget really easily is that this idea of the liberal individual is built on assumptions of the propertied and male head of the household, and that has gotten universalized in this concept, right? So what the sort of this kind of liberalism as a political concept, and again, this is not American political liberalism, right? This is a classical concept. What gets lost is the experiences of anybody who's not a man with property, right? So that's women, people of color, it's sort of people with disabilities, and it's also animals. It just kind of falsely universalizes a male experience, right? Where ecofeminism comes into this is so this classical liberalism severs the connection between individual and the non-human environment that sustains the individual. So our food, our minerals, our climate. ecofeminism tries to reconnect humans to the non-human environment. Where wild horses are concerned, it means honoring the lives and experience of both horses and the knowledge and experience of advocates as being important. So ecofeminism, feminist science studies emphasizes the idea of this concept of the remote. And anybody who's been to some of the wild horse ranges, like you really feel that notion of the remote, right? These are in some places that can be challenging to get to. But in this concept, when we think about being sensitive to the kind of a sort of a vulnerable existence, shared vulnerabilities that cut across species that all living bodies share, right? We do want to note that this idea of connectedness, so like this is not gender essentialism. This is not about like women being uniquely capable of being sensitive to nature because we have a uterus. Like it is more about the kind of insistence on recognizing a shared vulnerability and bringing these vulnerable players into a political conversation. Does that kind of make sense?
It does to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
So this is, sort of an increasingly important idea now. We have an administration that kind of more than others before them are explicitly working out of a gender ideology. So I think that is something to keep an eye on with this crowd in the White House right now. So that is sort of where our feminist science studies lens comes from. And I think that's kind of what we've got. That sort of sums up the approaches that we are taking to thinking about wild horse and burro politics. It's about recognizing the vulnerabilities of horses and advocates both, and arguing that they both deserve to be part of a political conversation, that individual animals are deserving of our moral concern. What are some other, just another concept or two that we kind of think about?
That I think we're sort of generally suspicious of systems of sort of categorization and classification that assign high value to some species and a low value or no value to others, because ultimately those are not, at least not fully scientifically established ideas, but they're often driven by all kinds of underlying values and prejudices, and to some extent just getting that out into the open is important. Yeah.
And then I think finally that for those advocates who are out with wild horses all the time, have so much knowledge that can be pulled into science, and that is kind of being overlooked because the rangeland management scientists don't see advocates as having a legitimate claim on knowledge, and we disagree with that. So that's what we are putting into our work. I just want to wrap up by offering you, for anybody who really wants to nerd out, we put together a little bibliography that is on a Google Drive that contains a list of a lot of the papers and scholarship that we pull from. So if anybody wants to dive in and read, point your phone at your screen right now and hit that QR code. A lot of these articles are open access, sort of anybody can click in and read. Some of them are behind subscription paywalls, in which you may need to get through your community library, or if there's a university library nearby. If you can't get to them, we can help you. We can send you a copy if there's something that you want to read, but you can't get access to. Just let us know, and that's our contact information there. And we're gonna wrap it there and see if there are any questions and see if I can find, there's the screen again. Okay, I'm gonna stop screen sharing. I don't know where those red lines came from in the middle of my presentation, and I decided in the moment to not try to deal with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that, Jen. I think one of our participants actually did that, and thankfully my wonderful husband Andrew sat down next to me and figured out how to get rid of it as quickly as we possibly could.
That's amazing.
So,
I assumed
my apologies.
Don't apologize. I assumed it was like some dumb thing that I did by accidentally turning the line drawer on, and
Well, I'm sad to say that while we were busy trying to figure that out, I missed Christian's talk altogether. So I'm
Oh,
going to be
golly.
requesting this video from
Golly.
Chris ASAP so I
Right?
can watch this again later today.
Morning, I believe.
Yeah,
Right.
no worries. No
And I
worries.
was so looking forward to it. I'm glad you put up the QR code about your programs or your papers, because that was one of the first questions we got from Diane today was, where can I read your papers? So that was a really good one. We have a couple other questions in the chat box, but one thing I wanted to ask you about, we've both been out to Saltwells Creek, and I don't know if you've ever bumped into Jay Duarte, the quote unquote wild horse specialist from Rock Springs, but I did a couple of summers ago when I was out there with my friend Victoria Williams.
Yeah.
And, he was very condescending to both of us. Like he knew more than we did. And, oh, I've got pictures of stallions on my phone. And okay, well, we have huge cameras with us. Like, you know, dealing with them in person is one thing, and 99% of advocates are never going to deal with a wild horse specialist in person unless you either go to a roundup or happen to bump into them on the range, or go to a local BLM office where you're likely just to speak to, somebody at the front desk anyway. But how would you suggest, as part of this summit, we're talking about advocacy, and like you said, 98% of advocates are women. We're getting a few more men here and there as we pull in some male photographers to see wild horses and we get them involved in advocacy. But how would you suggest that women advocates, not changing who we are, but how we do a much better job of communicating what we want in a calmer, more factual and professional manner with our legislators and so forth?
That Heather, that's a tension that we talk about in our paper about roundups. And I don't think we came to a conclusion about that, because ultimately the tension is around, in order to appeal to the rangeland managers, to decision makers, you sort of have to perform removing emotion from yourself, but it's that effective connection with the horses that makes them so alive for us, right? And it's what makes them worth protecting. I feel like I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's a kind of preemptively checking all that stuff at the door that happens, right? I've seen some other work where this happens in ornithology, right? Where people are passionate about conserving birds. People go out, band birds, they catch birds, and they're sort of care for the sort of bodies of the birds and their well-being in a way that is sort of very sort of affective, haptic. It's not
Very
about,
tender.
right, it's not
Yeah.
sort of about numbers and statistics and sort of management systems. And they sort of come alive in a way in the field, and then all of that sort of disappears when they give a testimony, at a hearing about protecting a beach or some other piece of land, right? Or some other sort of management aspect. And I think something important is really lost, right, by everyone. It's not just women who do this. You see it sort of from male scientists too, of course, who may have a harder time admitting to anyone, including themselves, that they are sort of emotionally affected by the work. I think that is important, and not and by sort of like voluntarily leaving that out because you're afraid of being painted as irrational, hysterical, crazy, all of that stuff. All of that is also real, right? And I can see why people do it. But sort of giving into those logics then makes you ignore the stuff that is what matters in the first place, I guess. So what that would look like, I don't think that means you have to sort of dress up as a pony, right? When you testify, but also why not, right? I mean, like a little bit more provocation around this stuff is sort of exactly what the system, like there's no way to not, like by withdrawing, right, and capitulating in the face of that kind of condescension that you describe experiencing at Salt Wells, like that's not helpful either, right? Because they're never going to take you seriously. You can sort of twist yourself into a pretzel and to try to sound like them, right? The sort of the respectability politics, that never works, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot from other social movements that supports the idea of audaciousness. You know, like I'm thinking about the HIV/AIDS movement.
Yeah, if you look at the
right?
strategies that ACT UP used in the 1980s and 90s to get attention, right? It wasn't like politely knocking on people's
It
doors
wasn't
saying,
spreadsheets.
hey, we're
yeah.
dying, you know, X many
Yeah.
people are dying of AIDS. Could we have a little bit
Yeah.
more funding, right?
Yeah.
They went and like disrupted meetings and, you know, were sort of civilly rather disobedient and very emotional. I don't think they would have gotten what they got out of AIDS research had they not taken those risks.
Yeah, and gay men were dismissed by authorities in the same way
Yeah.
as not
Right.
not being real people and not being people with any claims to legitimate knowledge. So I think there may be some lessons there, and obviously it's hard. Like, I mean, we're not saying like, I guess we're not saying don't go and scream and cry, but yeah, that's our best attempt at that, Heather.
Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay,
there's no
thank you.
simple solution. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, okay. Craig had a question. He says the science of ecology that treats of the interrelationships between and among all individuals. Oh, I just lost it.
We've got it in
All
chat here.
individuals, yeah, species aspects of our work leads to such value systems and concerns as you examine and promote. Is this correct?
I think I would say there's sort of, I think one way of reading sort of ecological science sort of does that, right? Because to the extent that ecological science, like any other sort of science with a capital S, right, sort of the natural sciences, are committed to this worldview that says our values that we have as sort of individuals or a culture don't really play any role in this, right? We're just examining, observing, measuring, weighing, calculating empirical facts, right, about a keystone species or a set of ecological relationships among a bunch of species. That is not, I'm not saying that knowledge is itself problematic, right? I mean, it's really important. Knowing all of that stuff as opposed to sort of not knowing it, or if you go back to a time where we didn't have that kind of science, what it does, right? Nothing comes without a price. What it does, or what it can do, is make itself appear not just as the producer of knowledge, but as the arbiter of what are ultimately political questions, right? So the question of what kinds of rangelands do we want to have now and in the future, I think, and our work says, is a political question. It's not a question that ought to be left to rangeland scientists or ecologists or experts in mineral extraction, right? Because all of their work is, in fact, informed by, whether they admit it to themselves or not, human values, political values, cultural values, about what and who matters. And so we're not saying that ecology or any other sort of science is, you know, wrong or not worth considering. Far from it. It's just this sort of second piece, right? This sort of second order, the scientists or a scientific field convincing itself and the rest of us that what they're doing is objective, obvious, not subject to sort of question, right? When the wildlife manager comes with this kind of condescending attitude toward other forms of knowing and knowledge and valuing wild horses. So that's the thing I think to push back against, this kind of, well, lie, basically, right? That what we're doing is objective and what you, the horse advocates, are doing is just sort of emotional and fuzzy-headed, whatever, not to be taken seriously. So that's the problem.
Yeah, the field of STS is here to remind us that humans do science, and humans carry their own personal politics into the science, even when they don't think they do that.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, Jen. I don't know if you see Cecile's question, but I personally love it because I do know you travel a little bit. So she says, question to Jen. I know you have photographed horses outside of the US. Can you tell the places where the horses are managed better or any kind of learning or difference outside of your travels?
Hey, Cecile, I love your work. Everybody should be following the Pixel Nomad. So I'm thinking of like Sable Island and the Wildpferdebahn.
Yeah, in Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia.
Yeah, which Cecile, I think, is in you're also based in Germany. Better managed. So one of, obviously the Sable Island gives us shows us what's possible when a national system, in this case Parks Canada, works with public opinion and works with sort of people and their feelings about an animal, and in this case the wild ponies on Sable Island, and has actually classified those horses as beings that belong on the island in perpetuity. And that is kind of rare, probably, case of a federal apparatus engaging with citizens and doing kind of public decision making around that. And that is the kind of process that I wish we could have here in the US. So that, I think that's a good example. Some interesting kind of variations in literally how wild horses in different countries are perceived. Like wow, I'm sorry, folks, we both have colds right now, and I feel especially dumb. What is the breed called it? The Wildpferdebahn.
Oh, they are, good question, I can't.
The horses
Maybe
at the
Cecile
wild.
knows.
Yeah, I know it, and I just lost the word. But they're kind of thought of
He
as
says the dolman horse.
Thank
Yes, the
you.
German, that's right.
Thank you. Like thought of as a different species, right, than domestic horses in a way.
Yeah.
And that is a really interesting window, I think. It's kind of both linguistic and kind of cultural, that although the Zulman horses are like, they live in captivity, they live in a great big pasture, but they're kind of still thought of as being wild and as kind of wild entities. So I mean, yeah, I think to me the ideal
Puerto Rico,
scenario
for
is
example,
Island.
like I know you've been to Puerto Rico a couple times, right? Like, how are the horses treated and respected there?
Well, technically not a foreign country.
It is in the
No,
US,
I
but
know.
I mean, a lot of the US doesn't think so, and culturally there are some differences. So interesting thing about Vieques is there is, and it's similar to, I think, Riverside County, where the Moreno Valley, California boroughs are, where in Moreno Valley in California, it's burros just kind of like wandering around your front yard, eating your shrubs. And people just kind of shrug and go, oh, look at those burros, look how cute they are. And in Vieques Island, similarly, the horses kind of have it's a sort of an open range, the entire island. And so you can find them. You land at the airport and you walk outside and there's a horse grazing right there. They are hanging out in the town park. They're walking down the street, and there's I think we would call it a kind of conviviality, and a view of horses and humans as being part of a shared world,
right?
In which we can find ways for everybody to thrive. In both of these places, they're not problem-free, obviously. Both burros and horses are herd on the road in both of these places. But it's also the case that the local human community thinks of these animals as an essential part of their local culture. There's, recently there was a move by San Bernardino County to remove a lot of the burros who wander from Riverside over into the city of San Bernardino, and to kind of remove those. And citizens push back, and we're articulating all of the ways that they see these burros as being just essential to their everyday lives. Both as kind of cultural partners, as well as doing ecological services like sort of grazing and reducing fire risk.
Yeah.
You want to add to that?
Yeah, I think sometimes a lot of these, this isn't unique to horses or burros at all. Sometimes a lot of these conversations around coexisting or living alongside sort of free roaming animals, wild animals in spaces that humans consider sort of theirs, whether it's the city or the suburb or roads, parks, whatever, is, predominantly framed in sort of a language around conflict, right? Whether it's vehicle collisions or herbivores eating your garden or, what have you. And what's, that, again, that sort of conflict perspective when all you talk about is conflict, you expect to see conflict, right? And everything gets sort of framed through this conflict lens. And so, choosing different words like, forbearance or conviviality or coexistence or hospitality doesn't mean that there are never problems, but if that's the sort of background assumption that everyone kind of belongs as part of this multi-species community, then there may be ways of figuring out coexistence that don't automatically or quickly move toward, removal or killing or lethal management or whether it's horses or coyotes or whatever, or raccoons. And so that I think is part of what for us would constitute good management. Because, I mean, the question isn't sort of not management, right? Because management is I think the choice is like, good management or bad management. And good management that is oriented around sort of a more convivial or flourishing idea of the future involves collaboration between a much broader group of stakeholders, not leaving those decisions to engineers and other kinds of experts. I always sort of the example I always use when you leave urban bridge designs to engineers, when you let the street engineers design an urban bridge, you get an extension of the highway, right? You don't get a bridge that makes room for pedestrians